While it might seem to many people today as though classical music has run its course and it's not interesting to people and it's kind of dying out and it's like an endangered species, I mean, that is true in a local level, but I suspect that as a metaphor, classical music will prove to be more valuable than many other things in the arts and therefore should have a life in the future.
The future of music. How is music and innovation going to work together?
Well, ecomusicology is a new field, and I think it's finding itself. It doesn't know yet what it really is. And musicology itself began in the second half of the 19th century. And it really was two things that it took a while to separate. And one was what became music theory. The other one became music history. And ecomusicology is roughly academics thinking about ecology and thinking about the discipline of music together. And where that will end up, I don't know, but my own feeling when I was asked by the person who runs the Ecomusicology journal to contribute something was that one of the problems with ecomusicology is that it didn't really tie in to the main repertory and history of classical music yet. And that it was really more like an escape and something new and something that would be cool and fun and different from that past. But if it's going to really have teeth and really grow strong legs, it somehow has to show itself as coming out of the history of classical music. And I think that that's something that interests me and that I found lacking in what had been done thus far in the field. Well, the first thing to say is that none of us have a crystal ball. So if we go out far enough in history, we have no clue what music will sound like a few hundred years from now, what people will be thinking about. We don't know where culture will be. We don't know either from a physical point of view or a mental point of view what fate holds for us. Something that I've put thought into, I mean, I think that where you can look at the future and see necessity. So it goes back to arguments from Malthus that are hundreds of years old now, and many people took great pleasure in sort of thinking that we had cheated Malthus of his legitimacy by our ingenuity, technologically speaking. But I think that in the end, what's happening now with climate change is really culture coming up against a brick wall, and that there are necessities in future behavior. So you can look at certain things that will be, they're non-negotiable. And I think that's where you can start looking at certain future pathways. I think that's interesting then to think of that in terms of culture as well, because there are always these interplays between culture and the rest of life. And I think that there's a very broad current of people imagining that classical music is something dying out. It's the old world. And my guess is that that's wrong. And that I think that just as I say that music is a metaphoric language and that we can talk about necessities for the future when we talk about things like climate change and just the basic physics of living on the Earth system as a species and making that a sustainable thing. I think that surprisingly, while it might seem to many people today as though classical music has run its course and it's not interesting to people and it's kind of dying out and it's like an endangered species, I mean, that is true in a local level, but I suspect that as a metaphor, classical music will prove to be more valuable than many other things in the arts and therefore should have a life in the future that will potentially be very central. I think that there's a lot that we have to change about the way that we think if we're going to make it through the next century or so. And that it's very relevant if we think about what we call the common practice period of classical music from Bach through Mahler, that the end of the common practice period was a time when there was a great amount of interplay between the beginnings of what was called ecology. It was a word coined by Ernest Haeckel, and classical music, where in Germany, Mahler was fascinated by Haeckelian thinking. He consciously made his largest work, the Third Symphony, based upon the idea of evolutionary thinking in a Haeckelian mold. And so I think that, there was this gigantic break in music and also the rest of culture at the time of the First World War, so just after Mahler died. And I suspect that we need to go back to that period just before the First World War and find threads there that will help us in the future. I think, for example, one of the big questions that is going to become a giant debate for the first half of this century is geoengineering. Because right now, when we talk about climate change, it's almost taboo to talk about it. We talk about mitigation. We talk about ways of changing the carbon economy of humans and tying that up with the carbon economy of the Earth system itself. That's what our primary job is now. But the fact of the matter is, no species can not have an impact on its environment. We do have agency, just like the termites in Africa have vast impacts on the African savanna ecology. And therefore, we need to shape the impact that we have and be willing to acknowledge our agency. And then that ties in with the concept of engineering. And in fact, what's so interesting is to think that, say, in Goethe's Faust, there was actually an open acknowledgement. It's fundamental to the plot of the primary work of German literature, really, of 150 years of German culture. And Mahler, in the late Common Practice, is setting exactly the end of Faust to music. And in Faust, it really ends with this thought about human society as a whole, technology, and agency. So the very end, when Faust finally dies, it's that he has made this pact with the devil where the devil will serve him while he's alive. When he dies, he will serve the devil in hell. And he will only die when he comes upon something so beautiful that he wishes to see time stop for that thing. And when that finally happens, it's this idea that Faust has of control by humans of the ocean and really winning back land from the sea for human habitation, which is very interesting to think that that's actually, in some ways, when we look at where we might need to geoengineer if all things go well. So let's say we manage to not only meet, say, the Paris Agreement, the so-called 2-degree plan, but go beyond that, we still do well. And yet, if you look closely at what's going on, so the West Antarctic ice sheet is probably already fated to collapse. And the amount coming off of Greenland that's already fated based on the time period that we can say that there will be this elevated, what a climatologist would call radiative forcing. Basically, the amount of sea level that these different major sources, the West Antarctic ice sheet and Greenland, will give over the next several hundred years. Whatever we do, even if we get carbon under control, it doesn't warm so much that it completely destroys civilization. It's going to be uncomfortably high. And there's very little discussion of it because the discussions of sea level usually are what is sea level going to be in the 21st century. But the fact of the matter is it's a very slow response. So it won't really pick up unless we're really in something worse than we think until the middle of this century. That's when it will begin a real rapid, in other words, it's what's called an exponential change. So it starts slowly and then it starts getting really, really intense in its acceleration later. And so the point of this is that I think that is one of the ways, just what Goethe was imagining, which had become kind of the classic of German literature by the late Common Practice, and Mahler setting it in his single most successful work, the words just after that passage in Goethe's Faust he sets to music. I think that that is exactly the kind of engineering we might end up having to do. And it would involve playing around with parts of the West sheet. It wouldn't be anything like what's imagined in Faust, which is really what it was for Goethe. He was thinking of the great engineering of early Western civilization. He called his visit to Italy, and Rome in particular, his second birthday. And in Rome, there had been these big engineering projects going back thousands of years, where they took the swamps outside of Rome and they dried them out. And so that's what he was thinking of. But it is like thinking about geoengineering, which we're going to have to do. Well, I guess I would say that I think the language that Mahler was using, which he saw as kind of a compendium of everything written until his time, and in a way, I think, still in music criticism today, that's the way that many people look at Mahler's largest works. He's using everything at his disposal and the power of classical music as a kind of elaboration of feeling through time to make metaphoric statements about the structure of the world. That's essentially the way he sees it. And I think really the third symphony, more than Das Lied von der Erde, is a kind of symphony of global ecology or something. He saw the first movement as being about the beginning of life, and all the subsequent movements as being about forms of life leading towards first complexity. So you saw plants, and then animals, and then mankind, and then finally the end, the last movement, it's love is supposed to be the topic, and that's really right out of the way that Darwin was perceived in Germany from the very beginning. The first translation was by Braun, and Haeckel was the one who was writing about Darwinism for the Germans, and this word Darwinismus was coined by the first translator, who was himself a scientist and had published works about extinction of species and so on before he translated Darwin's work. And I think that nowadays, the language of contemporary music, it's coming out of post-Second War modernism and having a very hard time being as rich a language as music was back then. And of course, one of the things that has happened in music history over the past quarter century is the end of that high modernism and this kind of question mark over where classical music is going. So minimalism in the US became a very large force. I guess being a composer myself, I have to be honest and say I'm not satisfied with any of these major streams, the isms of our time. And so minimalism doesn't provide a rich enough language to really make commentary on the future. And I don't think that, of course, serialism, very few people take that seriously as the way of any future at this point. I think, everyone is finding their way, basically. I think a good thing is that now there's an acceptance of a wide approach of, different musical languages. But I think that in the US, there's a kind of commercialism that controls many of the composers and what they're doing. But in Europe, there's still a vestige of the old high modernism that controls the approach too much, I think, here. And so I'm looking at ways that I feel I have the largest vocabulary to try to, like in that period that I would call the end of natural philosophy, by which I mean that natural philosophy was a word used by many scientific figures. I mean, most of the great scientists until the 20th century would have called themselves natural philosophers. That's what they were, really. And it meant that they were thinking about the world as a whole, and they had a specialization that related to thinking analytically about nature, so the universe and the physical world around them. And that was part of a whole complex of thought. And natural philosophy really dies. Ernest Haeckel is literally the last great natural philosopher, and someone who, Gustav Mahler, who we often think of as the last great classical composer before atonal music sort of created this modernism and something really a fundamental break with the history of what I called before the common practice period. So there was a direct link, actually, between the last great composer Mahler of the common practice and the last great natural philosopher. I think we need to refine that somehow. So I think we need to refine natural philosophy, which I think that Lynn Margulis, who was a co-developer of Earth system science and also the most common classification of life, the five kingdom view of life on Earth, was done by Lynn together with Robert Whittaker. And now there's the three kingdom view of the world, but I think that Lynn's view is still very, very strong and in educational systems throughout the world, very common. And I think that she was like a modern Haeckel in a way. And I had a great luck to get to know Lynn. I was part of her last book. In a way, if we talk about my own life and science, I was kind of drawn into science more than I ever would have been because of Lynn and knowing her, and she kind of inspired me to do more than I would have done otherwise. But I don't feel it's hurt me at all as a musician. I think it's very enriching, actually. And I do daily work at the piano and writing music and everything, just like every other musician. But I think the fact that I took some time off to really get sort of deeper in the science is just a good thing, actually. I mean, the first thing to say is that when we're talking about high modernism, one of the problems for many, many people, and I just think of composers I know in the United States, the first thing that they would say that they disliked about the history of modernism in classical music compared to modernism in painting or literature or something was that it was as though all the composers were pretending to be scientists. And they weren't. And so for me, the actual interplay with getting involved with science more deeply, it's not at all like I pretend to be more of a scientist in writing music. Rather, I'm using broad metaphors that I see as important, and I want to find a musical language that helps me to express those metaphors. It doesn't mean pretending to be scientific where it's not justified. I don't think that we, for example, if music is a language, you can't just recreate a new language like the language of life. You can't, if you're to pretend, to go back to, let's say, Frankenstein and Shelley and all of that, you can't just do anything you want and make something. You can throw together, nowadays, there's all kinds of experimentation with cloning and so on, with messing around with DNA, but you can't just do anything. It won't work. I mean, nature is constantly experimenting at the microbial level. All kinds of things can be changed, but I mean, we can't just stupidly put things together. They don't go anywhere. So I think we can write whatever we want as composers, but it doesn't, I think that there are sort of unfolding natural laws as metaphor, actually, and that I have some belief in that of course we can, if we want, we can disregard that and we can listen to anything, but I do think there is, in the way that Heinrich Schenker at the beginning of music theory, he felt that there was something in the great classical music that was like a parallel to the unfolding of natural law and science, and I think that there is some legitimacy there. And if so, then music evolves slowly, and there's this moment when Rachmaninoff said during his first visit to the US, he was asked some question and he said that he was like a music evolutionist. And I think what he meant was his music, it was just this very slow incremental change over, Chopin really, although he was writing it, 100 years after Chopin. And I think there's some validity to that. I think music has to go at its own way and its own pace. So definitely my dealing with science doesn't make me like some kind of new scientific method or something like that. I don't think that at all. Rather, it makes me interested in certain things that were going on just before the beginning of modernism, and then finding threads in that and bringing it into new places. That's what I would say is a compositional technique. In terms of science itself, I guess maybe I would say that maybe music is good for cogitating different kinds of things where, for example, in a big Bach fugue, you'll have sometimes an augmentation and a diminution. So in other words, the principal subject of the fugue will be going on at 3 rates at once. And that's absolutely unique to Western classical music. If you think of other music around the world, it just doesn't happen. Popular music or something, folk music all around the world, there's nothing like that. And so I think that kind of thing is maybe, when I've thought about scientific issues, where I've gone, where it's interested other people, has been that kind of thinking and applying it. So thinking at multi-temporal scales of problems. I was in a think tank. We were dealing with issues of certain geoengineering concepts. So for example, the United States Academy of Science did a multi-volume analysis of geoengineering possibilities. And they thought that marine cloud brightening was probably the most promising thing if we had to do such a thing in the future. And I was in this think tank in which Stephen Salter, who is the primary engineer of marine cloud brightening, he works with the originator, a guy named John Latham, a climate scientist, a marine scientist, who thought up the idea. So it's basically taking just sea salt spray, but you're putting it into the air, and then that changes the reflectivity of the surface of clouds, and that cools the planet. You could do it at a large scale, and it would help us if global warming took off too much. Well, I was thinking about it and having questions for Stephen Salter, who's this amazing engineer. He's the inventor of modern wave energy. And I was asking him about interactions between his concept and this thing that's thought about in Earth system science by Gaia theorists called claw. The claw hypothesis is this idea that in nature that there are organisms at the sea surface which are themselves changing cloud structure to make things cooler. And so how would these two things interact? The sort of like the natural marine cloud brightening and the artificial one of humans. And interesting to me was that Stephen Salter himself didn't think anything. He said there's no problem whatsoever. So I kept taking this question, and I went around, and I finally went to a guy who is at Los Alamos National Lab, where he is the creator of a biogeochemical computer model that wins against all other such models. They have like competitions periodically for sea surface biogeochemistry computer modeling. And his, called COSM, wins globally. And he he said, I think you're exactly right. There will be a problem between the two. And he thought it was a particularly interesting thing that he would even like to write a paper on it, except that he was still mostly working on the future of his model because he thought that his model would be able to answer exactly my question in the future, although it's not ready yet. And what I suspected would be the issue would be that, in a sense, because the organisms that do this thing have some metabolic self-interest in doing it, that basically if we start doing it, they will end up doing it less, to the point that we would have to replace all of what they do. And therefore, it means that the idea will work less well than Stephen Salter and other scientists were thinking it would work. So that's just an example of how when I think about these kinds of things, what I like to do is think about it at multi-temporal scales. That's the way that I usually start. And that sort of inspires me to think of different kinds of interactions that other people aren't thinking of. So. I think it's all connected. The the subject matters that I choose for my pieces grows out of what I do in the rest of my life. I think it would be easy to become bogged down and too limited if all of my pieces were then to be about global warming or something like this. That isn't right either. I think music is an abstract language. I think it exists on its own. I don't want to be pinned down to, because obviously climate change is a key or the key issue of the immediate future for us if we're going to make it. Of course, it's on people's minds, but it doesn't mean that art for art's sake and without any kind of verbal inspiration isn't still 100% valid. So I want to have that free space, but definitely in recent years there's been a lot of interplay between the thinking that I'm doing about these ecological issues and climate change and the rest, and music, where music is going.